Hey, Nathaniel.
Hey.
And everybody else. I just saw Nathaniel big on the screen. I'm I'm not picking greeting favorites. I wave at the first person I see. How was everybody's weekend?
Pretty good.
Right. We're going to talk about sleep today. It's not going to be long. We're not going to go very long. But I'll probably do 4 lectures on sleep, and then that's it. And I'm just going to come up with a final, and we can, chat if you want. But I think I'll do today, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, and then I don't know when the semester actually ends, when the last day of class is, but we can just meet and chat, and I'll put the final up, and you can go through the final. We'll do it in the same way. You can take it and then retake it and retake it until you get the grade you like. I don't know how. I'll give you like 3 retakes or something, not like unlimited, but so you can do it like a total of 4 times or something. And then at the end, it's not going to tell you which ones you got right or wrong. I don't know. I'll figure that stuff out. I'm just thinking now. And if I think into the microphone, maybe I'm giving confusing directions that way. So I'll stop doing that. And let me pull up the lecture. But we probably have enough content to do 4 sleep lectures. And so we'll just do the introduction today of circadian rhythms, stuff like that. So here's us sleeping away the night. I'm pulling up the chat box. I know a couple of people are, I know like Ross is doing just audio. He's back home on a circadian clock. These are the lectures that I would approve. If somebody's, your circadian rhythm makes these lectures really impossible or uncomfortable to attend, these are the exact lectures that you should just watch the video on, because I'm going to be talking about how detrimental to health sleep disturbances, circadian rhythm disruptions, jet lag, stuff like that. I think probably on Friday we'll get to stuff like jet lag and Nathaniel's work, right? When you have some shift work, when you have some overnight shifts, and we'll get to a lot of that stuff. What we'll talk about throughout the lifespan, differences in sleep, what happens in utero, what happens at puberty, what happens among geriatric folks, what happens to the sleep, to r.e.m sleep, especially at these different stages. All the different kind of health consequences, strategies to improve sleep, but all that stuff's going to come at the end. We're just going to do the foundation first of what the hell is sleep, what is a diurnal cycle, what are circadian rhythms, what do the typical sleep patterns look like, what is dreaming, what is sleep. All of that stuff we'll do to set the foundation, and then we'll start talking about disruptions and interventions and all of that. So we'll get there. But just quick, we'll drop all of this stuff after today and strictly talk about sleep. And then as we get closer to the test, I will upload a PDF of all the checklists of stuff to knows. But I just didn't want to skip stuff entirely. So remember, you want to train somewhere between sea level and, definitely lower than this. I mean, definitely lower than that. I mean, that's really a high altitude. If you're up that high, that's not helpful for training. But, if you want to get altitude exposure, I don't know, around here or something, like you want to be probably closer to sea level than to this if you want to elicit an outcome. And it's just a couple of weeks. After about 2 weeks, most of these adaptations that are going to accompany you onto the playing field or the track or the whatever it is, they're going to set in about 2 weeks in all of these different domains. I mean, mostly you're just going to perform badly, but the improvements that can be elicited, the improvements that you can get, are going to set in within a couple of weeks. And then after that, you don't really see much more improvement. You sort of level off. Now, all of these different approaches that people have slogans for everything. Train low, sleep high, and train high, sleep low, train high, sleep high. All of these different strategies. Some of this is going to be placebo effect. If you just give somebody a diet, you say you're on the avocado diet, you eat nothing but avocados for 3 weeks. I mean, eat as many avocados as you want, but that's all you get to eat for 3 weeks. That and water, and with lemon in it or something. You give people really specific instructions. Like, everything works for a while. Like, oh, awesome. You eat like 4,000 calories of avocado on day one. Day two, you're like, it's just like green shit I can't eat anymore. And people have limitations, or they have strategies, or whatever it is. Any sort of exercise prescription, nutritional prescription, if people follow that stuff, they're going to see progress. But with a lot of these altitude training prescriptions, it's not really scientifically validated to the degree that we all assume. Oh, you just have to train low and then just sleep at altitude. Yeah, but just like sleeping in heat doesn't prepare you to train in heat. If you go to Saudi Arabia or something, or the United Arab Emirates or whatever, go to like Abu Dhabi and sleep there for a while. That doesn't prepare you to be a soccer player in the heat, right? You have to specificity of adaptation. That's really what's going to matter. I'm looking at the comment box. Yeah, so there's a question about in the comment box. Totally ignore. I can't change those Canvas grades, so ignore what Canvas says about your grades. I have no control there. Your terminal grade is the last one that you took. Canvas just logs everything. It's incredibly inconvenient to do grading on Canvas for a lot of these things. It's like if there's extra credit questions or whatever, it's just sort of a mess. So I do all of my grading in an Excel file. So ignore what Canvas tells you about your grade. Okay, so when we look at training at altitude, probably the best approach. Now, I can't guarantee this is the best approach, but probably the best approach is figure out what altitude you're going to perform at. Is it 5,000 feet? Is it 10,000 feet? Where does the performance take place? And then I would do at least some of your training at that performance. Now, remember my approach, my strategy when we were talking about the specificity of adaptation and incorporating that into conditioning programs. And I said, how do you run a mile in 5 minutes? Like, your goal is to run a 5-minute mile. Well, there's 3 stressors that you have to consider there. One of them is 5 minutes. You have to have your metabolism go at an extreme rate for 5 minutes. You can't give up at 4 minutes, because then you haven't, cleared the full time. You probably haven't cleared the mile. So 5 minutes. So duration is one stressor. Speed is a stressor, right? Muscle contraction velocity. And you have to be able to maintain that specific speed. Part of that is metabolic, but part of it is neuromuscular and sort of skeletal cross-bridge cycling mechanics. So speed is a stressor. And then the third stressor is distance, right? There's a certain number of foot strikes there. There's a number of leg swings and contractions and the actual distance. So there's 3 different stressors to consider. If you only train one of them, if all you train is distance, that's not the optimal strategy. Are you going to get better at running a mile if you just run a mile every day? Yeah. But if you can train for the time, see how far you can run in a 5-minute duration, get 5 minutes of stress, expose your body to 5 minutes, maybe like 5 minutes and 10 seconds or something, and expose yourself to the full mile, and then figure out the speed that you have to run, 12 miles an hour, whatever it is, and run at that exact speed so your muscles can get used to enduring that particular stress, that load. Same thing with altitude. Well, what are the conditions of play if you're going to try to be equipped to perform at that level? Well, altitude is one of them, right? The metabolism, maybe there's a at altitude, maybe the climate is a little bit colder, um, but it's going to be a little bit hypoxic, hypobaric at that altitude. So that's one of the stressors. But the other stressors are still going to be things like speed and stuff. So um, figuring out exactly what altitude it is and then training at that altitude seems to be optimal. Although if you train at lower altitudes for some of those workouts, you can get the speed of contraction, you can get those other stressors. So I wouldn't necessarily train at high altitude for every single workout, but training at the performance altitude does seem to be a useful training strategy. Data are surprisingly limited. You think it would be incredibly abundant, but there isn't that much data on this. So this one came out in 2018. They're like, yeah, data is limited, whatever, data are limited. Sex doesn't seem to be much of a difference between males and females. And there are some nutritional parameters here. I mean, stuff like eat a ton of carbohydrates, that's helpful for some performances. If you look up Jeff Volek's work, Volek, he does a lot of work with Steve Phinney, PH Phinney is the other one who talks about the uh, endurance merits of ketogenic dieting. And there's compelling research there too. I mean, if you're like a power athlete, you're a sprinter, you're something that has a lot of anaerobic metabolism, I would go ahead and not do that. Like, I would not consider low carbohydrate dieting. But for endurance stuff, there's compelling work that would oppose high dietary intake of carbohydrate, and there's a philosophy of carbohydrate where it is eat low or train low, compete high, where you go ketogenic during training and then you sort of carb load beforehand, so you have optimal lipolysis. You're lipolytically, double your opponents. I mean, your rate of lipolysis really does speed up to this. I mean, just the r.e.m. of your lipolysis is huge in a ketogenic diet. And then you introduce a bunch of carbohydrates, and you might be able to optimize a couple of systems a little bit better. But there's a lot of data here about the carbs. But in general, this is a good list. This is a good list of dietary strategies to get ready for an endurance event at altitude. Okay, now we're in space. Now we're in super altitude. Okay, we're up in outer space. And at this point, the oxias aren't really a thing because it's like non-oxia, right? You can't breathe that out in the abyss out there. And so it stops being a matter of lung mechanics and kind of oxygen transfer, and the microgravity itself becomes the big deal. At first, during takeoff, for those few minutes when you're just flying up there and just being pummeled, that's one thing, right? So that's a biological stress during like 3, 2, 1, and that stuff is happening. That's one stressor. But the subsequent stressor is just like nothing. You're floating and stuff. And the psychological stress. Remember this part. For microgravity, psychological stress, you have to know everything. It's the like I hate cliches, like the jack of all trades kind of um, phenomenon. Where I mean, you have to be a good physicist. You have to be. I mean, you're going to be like drinking your pee, so you have to be. I mean, you have to be a good electrician if something goes wrong. You have to be. You have to know all of the research. You have to be a medic. Yeah, I mean, there's just everything you have to be, and then you're just lonely up there. I mean, it's just this isolated, lonely space with like no people and correspondence and stuff. And then the space motion sickness, everyone, 60 to 80% of astronauts get that. And as we move into this age of, pay a couple $100,000 and you can go up into outer space for a little bit, I think barely into outer space. You can go up into microgravity for a little, like going to the moon. I mean, again, like outer space, we're talking, if I can go back. We're talking like here. Like that's we're gonna get up like down here or something. Not we're not going like way out here for if we're gonna be sending up civilians who have enough money. But there's just going to be like everybody's going to be nauseated and sick, and the Dramamine won't be enough for them. uh, Circulatory changes are going to develop. Normally what we experience, remember the salad dressing, if you have oil and vinegar in one bottle and you shake it up and stuff, gravity separates it. Gravity brings the oil down and the vinegar up. Is that the right way? Yeah, that's the right way. Doesn't matter. One of them goes up, one of them goes down. And but so we too experience all of these circulatory changes. A lot of our fluids go intracellular. We lose extracellular volume and it goes intracellular. And in the periphery, in the legs and the periphery, we lose volume and it all goes into core circulation. We do pee a little bit more, but not as, we don't lose as much fluid as was once thought, but we do definitely lose some. And then just atrophy of everything and radiation. Remember, this just through closed eyes, you can see little flashes. This is just saying like astronauts, right? Astronauts go up into outer space, and that microgravity, it's hard to endure. You have your vestibular apparatus, these semicircular canals, fluid filled, and you're sitting in a car, you're half asleep, someone breaks a little bit too hard and your heart starts going, you like kind of jostled into alertness, and you can tell these accelerations of your head, where you are in space and how you're moving, and you can tell this stuff by this vestibular apparatus, and you kind of lose the ability to do that. Proprioception becomes a little bit of a mess up there. Integrating visual cues with non-visual stimuli, with sort of proprioceptive and acceleration information, it just loses translation. And when you can't integrate in that way, it gets like weird and confusing and nauseating. Apparently, I've never been there. Um, and so but your eyes, if you're looking around the ship, right, you can tell it's sort of up and down, sort of. But you look out the window, what's up and what's down, you have no idea. And so the whole thing, all of your senses get a little bit um, messy, right? It just gets a little bit hard to interpret what is background information on Earth, right? What is just normal background. Like if you go into one of those silent rooms that just, it's complete silence. Like people go crazy in those things. The Gansfeld procedure, where you try to eliminate all sensation. Just eliminate all sensation, put little ping pong balls over your eyes or have whatever, just eliminate any visual thing, try to eliminate any sound, eliminate any tactile sensation. I mean, people are hallucinating when this stuff happens. So you go up into outer space and you lose a lot of your sensation, and it can become a problem on top of what's your social network and what's your kind of normal kind of social health up there. The gravity, now this is a exaggeration, obviously, these diagrams. I mean, this is like, cereal box mascot kind of. It's like the acrobat from Coraline, if you've seen that. So this is a little bit extreme, this is exaggerated, but this is an illustration of the pattern that you see. You're on Earth and you look like a person, right? You go up into outer space and you look like the Coraline acrobat. Blood volume, you just start losing fluid from the legs. It goes into the kind of core circulation, but your kidneys, remember, you have um, those baroreceptors, and they are going to sense this high pressure. Like, okay, we should probably remedy this pressure a little bit. And in the heart, in the atria, you are sensing blood volume, and you have atrial natriuretic peptide that says, let's pee a little bit of this stuff out. And so you do lose a little bit of volume. Again, chambers, right? So where you're storing your fluid changes, it goes more intracellular. You don't lose that much total volume. You do lose total volume, but it's not so extreme. But when you do go back to Earth, what you end up seeing is this reduced volume, total reduced volume, and for a time in like the brain, you're getting reduced volume. So this is just saying, it's a little bit more complicated than the previous ideas of you go up at altitude and you just like pee it all out, and because you're talking about the arginine vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, right? Vasopressin, that response, and the baroreceptor response, and the atrial natriuretic peptide, but fluids get shifted around, and not in a good way if you're going to ever return to Earth. But again, you see intracellular fluids changing down here, increasing, extracellular fluids um, being reduced. And so this is just a look at, here's you normally, you go up in outer space and a bunch of additional blood flow up here, and then you normalize it, and then you go back down to gravity, and you pool in the legs again. It just draws from everywhere else. You might lose a couple of percent. The goal is not to. The goal is to lose no bone mass when you go into outer space. But pretty rapidly, every month you're losing a couple of percent of bone mass. And the more people exercise and apply loads, think Wolff's Law, the more you can ward off some of that bone metabolism, right? Because normally osteoblasts, osteoclasts, but if you lose that regulation and you favor catabolic signals, if catabolism predominates, breakdown, you're not seeing loads. The body is just trying to create the skeleton it needs, create the muscle mass that it needs, create the body that's fit to its environment. In outer space, what do you need bones for? I mean, like everything weighs an ounce. Like the giant boulder can be lifted. I mean, like nothing is there's no need for a strong skeletal structure. There's no need for strong muscles. There's no need for any of that. And the body's trying to be fit, be compatible with its environment, be suitable to the stressors and loads of that environment. So this is where you lose a lot of your bone mass. What old people lose, the geriatric population, they fall and break their hip, right? Well, it's the same problem here. And as we get into the sleep, when we transition into sleep, and kind of older folks lose a lot of their sleep. And we'll get to this on probably, I don't know, Friday, maybe even next Monday when we talk about probably Friday, when we're talking about sort of geriatric sleep patterns, and there's this idea that, like, well, old people just don't need as much sleep. The body doesn't generate it. They don't seem to be as impaired by deficits in sleep. Yeah, they just don't need as much sleep. That's hilarious. Like, that's not even close to true. It's the same thing as saying, like, when old people, when they lose, all their bone density and their hips, they just don't need bone density in their hips. Obviously, like, they fall and break their hips all the time. And so there are problems with aging, whether it is bone density, whether it is sleep, that manifest, and strategies to try to remedy that stuff. Now, strategies in outer space, we'll talk about strategies of sleep later, but strategies in space, just if you can replicate Earth loads, that's best. If you go up with bands and stuff like that, the ranges of motion and the tension created throughout those ranges of motion, they just don't represent gravity. And so people will use vacuums to try to do it. I think Proteus would probably work for upper body stuff, because this constant isotonic force. Isokinetic loads you could do, but that's not Earth gravity. I don't know why anybody uses that to see. Here's how our return to play testing battery. Let's do isokinetic, a movement that your body has never done, before the digital age, and so trying to replicate Earth stress, Earth gravity, Earth loads in astronauts. It's Philip Goldnick. That's the guy who did some of these original astronaut studies, looking at tissue samples and kind of how the erosion that happens to the human form in outer space, and the need to remedy it. Okay, let's move into some sleep. There's a couple of good sources. Mostly what I'm talking about, I'm going to have a lot of articles on the screen that you can see and you can reference, and so that's a lot of what I'm getting from is these articles. But these are both good sources, and especially Matthew Walker's book. This one's phenomenal. So I would recommend this book to everybody. This podcast, there's 4 episodes on sleep, and it's pretty good. There's some stuff. He's a big name. So Matthew Walker is at, I think he's at Berkeley. I think Huberman's at Stanford. So they're both local-ish. Huberman says some stuff that I'm just like, you go look in the literature, like that's not consistent with what's said in the literature. Matthew Walker, I like both of these. Matthew Walker is just a stud. And so this book is phenomenal over here. But so there's a lot of what I'm going to say is kind of inspired or derived from these sources, in particular this book. But then I'll also have a lot of journal articles that I'll put up here, so you know where all my sources are coming from. So sleep. I've heard a lot of people talk about, why do people sleep? And I was at Pacific, and I'm not going to name who it was, but I was here at Pacific, and there was a faculty member who said, I think the reason historically that we slept is like, what the hell do you do at night? We're not nocturnal. The diurnal as compared to nocturnal. We'll talk about these terms in just a minute. But as this sort of diurnal species, we have a 24-hour day-night cycle, and we're not active at night. We're not nocturnal. We're diurnal. And so it was just something to pass the time. What are people supposed to do when it's night? You can't see that well. There's some predators out there. Well, let's just kind of camp out at night, and then in the daytime, well, let's just try to pass the time. And that's not a good definition of sleep, because every animal and creature and pest, and I'm sure Pokemon, that has ever been studied sleeps. Bugs, right? Flies, like a house fly, sleeps. And there's some interesting studies on how they do it, because what they can't do is put little electrodes on them. An EEG, let's look at brain waves. They can't do that on a housefly, right? But what they can do is notice these periods of movement, and then periods of where they're just quiescent or dormant, right? They don't do anything. You can sort of, if you sleep deprive a fly, a bug, right? If you sleep deprive one of these things, you can like shorten its life, but which has implications for humanity if we can get anything from a fly and extract that and make sentences and claims about people. But if you sleep deprive it for a while and you build up this appetite, this hunger, this sleep pressure, as they call it, you can make that thing just really go into slumber, and you can like poke it and it doesn't wake up. You can really set this thing into a deep sleep and sort of prod it, and then eventually it wakes up and flies around. And you can't poke it anymore. Bees, every little mosquito and everything that's been studied that has a real lifespan. If it lives like an hour and dies or something, okay, but we're not talking about those. But anything with like an actual lifespan, all of that stuff sleeps. And there's rumors about sharks, like, oh, sharks don't sleep. Or like, they never close their eyes. They're always on the prowl. They're on the lake. The sharks don't have eyelids. Okay, that's why they don't close their eyes. They have no eyelids. Sharks totally sleep. All aquatic life sleeps. Now, it's fascinating when you start looking at aquatic life and the type of sleep that you see. Probably on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the different stages of sleep. I'm wearing a Fitbit, and it's like, here's your light sleep, and here's your deep sleep, and here's your r.e.m. sleep. And we'll talk about these different stages of sleep. But r.e.m. sleep is the really fascinating one. Not that many creatures do it. Birds do it. people and mammals do it, right? So mammals and birds, we do the REM sleep, but there are aquatic mammals, right? So you have your dolphins and your whales and whatever. Not really REM sleepers. And we'll talk about all this stuff when we get there, but there's different types of sleep that you see, and land mammals, birds, we're getting the REM sleep. But sharks totally sleep. Everything sleeps. Now, what gets really fascinating is when you look at what is sort of the oldest creatures that we know of. I mean, let's go back to the Cambrian explosion and maybe before. And all right, what creatures were alive? Like let's get before the dinosaurs. Surely a T-Rex, had a little drowsy, session every day, and kind of leaned up against a tree and whatever, huffed and puffed its way through, like snoring and stuff. But before the dinosaurs, worms, right? Worms were living it up before the dinosaurs. And so, 500,000,000 years ago. And we're seeing sleeping. Now, the sleep in worms, this little passage right here is from this article. Talking about what is kind of historically thought of the Cambrian explosion and worms. This picture is not from any of the articles, but there's a lot of work on worms and sleep, and the sleep doesn't really resemble person sleep. It's not like people sleeping, but there are in evolutionary biology. We'll talk about eyesight on Wednesday and how light helps set our circadian rhythms. Our circadian rhythms are established in part through light exposure, mostly early in the day. There's sort of a circadian dead space in the middle of the day, but early in the day, the light exposure and what seems to be eyeballs have, and I keep hearing like sounds. So if you're not muted, if you feel free to unmute if you want to speak up. It's a little bit noisy. Uh, but vision seems to have developed in a lot of lineages, independently in a lot of lineages. It's not like, well, vision developed at this particular point in evolutionary history and spread all over the place. Vision seems to have developed independently. But sleeping, maybe that was just the birth of sleeping. And Matthew Walker has a good point in his book where he says, like, the question of why do we sleep? And that answer that I heard a few years ago of like, well, we're bored. What else is there to do tonight? We're not nocturnal. But all creatures sleep. If it didn't make sense in the light of evolution, if it didn't make sense in evolutionary biology, it wouldn't exist. Because you go to sleep and you're just lying there helpless. A predator can just come eat you without a chase. I mean, wouldn't, if it weren't incredibly advantageous for performance and function and a necessity for biology, we wouldn't do it because it's just this vulnerable point. But Matthew Walker said, what's the point of waking up? It's not what's the point of sleeping. What's the point of waking up? Maybe we started as a bunch of sleepers. Maybe that came first. In biology, maybe sleep was the first stage and then wakefulness was the second stage. Now you'd have to go get food. So whatever, there's a lot to discuss in there. There would be a lot to unpack, and so that's not a conversation we're going to have. But the necessity of sleep is fascinating, and go find a creature that doesn't do it. This seems to have you go as early as you want in evolutionary biology, and they're sleepers. Everything sleeps. And some stuff sleeps a lot, right? And this is just from Washington.edu page. They had a bunch of citations down here. Whatever. This is where I took this from. The brown bat, about 20 hours a day. That thing is sleeping. But here's our possums, right? All those little. I don't know if they're hideous, I think, but they could be cute if you look at them that way. 18 hours a day, something like that. The armadillos, a human infant. right? Now, a fetus is, in the stomach. We'll talk about this when we get to across the lifespan and sleep and different types of sleep, and like when the babies are kicking, right? They're just sleeping. That's not like, oh, it's dancing. Oh, no, I'm talking to it and it hears me and it's like, no, it's just asleep, and it's just these frenetic surges, and it has nothing to. That's just like it's the equivalent of sleepwalking is what the babies do, because they just sleep all the time. There's almost no wakefulness in a fetus. They pretty much sleep the entire pregnancy. Um, but they haven't developed, in a person in REM sleep. We'll talk about this later. In a person in REM sleep, you're going to depress movement. You essentially become paralyzed during REM sleep, and there's implications for aquatic mammals that you can piece together already. But infants sleep a lot, but a fetus is pretty much permanently asleep. And there's your ferret. Contrasting that, some animals don't sleep very much. The giraffe seems to sleep for 4 to 5 hours. There's a lot of lying around. It lounges. It adopts postures of what could be considered sleep. It's not really sleeping. And so what you seem to see, this passage right here is from the top one. But they seem to sleep 4 to 5 hours a day, something like that. So all creatures sleep, and all creatures have a circadian rhythm, where we're sleeping with a circadian rhythm. Now, Carpe Diem, right? So when we're talking about circadian, let's start with Carpe Diem. What it literally means is pluck the day. Pluck the day is Carpe Diem, but it's come to mean seize the day, go capture it, right? And I think it was 1989, late 80s, early 90s, I think 89. Dead Poet Society came out. I have it somewhere in my cabinets somewhere. But so there's Robin Williams, Carpe Diem, seize the day, boys, make your lives extraordinary. And it was apparently based on a University of Connecticut professor. This is Samuel Pickering. This is the Wikipedia page about it, talking about this UConn professor where I did my PhD. I did not know who that was. But seize the day is what Carpe Diem has come to mean. Circadian, circa, circa 1950. It means like about 1950, in the range of 1950. Circadian, right? So it should be circa diem, because that's what a day means. You could say dies or diem, but dien, that's like the Latin dien, English, that isn't one. Right? But Latin diem, English day, right? So really it should be circadian, right, as opposed to circadian. But fine, circadian, about a day. Now, diurnal as opposed to nocturnal, right? So there's some nocturnal species and there's some diurnal species. Here, this is the day-night cycle. So circadian is this about a day is what it means. Diurnal is more in reference to the day and night cycle, to the light and dark cycles. And in these cycles, you see body temperature changing. We'll talk about that. That's a huge part of sleep and wakefulness, is your body temperature. Melatonin, we're going to talk about the circadian rhythms of melatonin. And, people call it like, the vampire hormone or whatever. It is suppressed by light and is released in darkness. We're going to talk about that. We'll pretty much start with the pineal gland on Wednesday. But there's a lot of, we have to be compatible with the day-night cycle, like when we can actually see stuff, when we should be active, the types of verbs that we do have to be compatible with it. And pretty much every animal species has some sort of a rhythm, nocturnal or diurnal rhythm. And these circadian rhythms and the diurnal cycles, these are really travel together, in large part, because light and darkness determine our circadian rhythms. Not exclusively. We have an internal biological clock that's going to go on ticking and turning very reliably with no input from light. We'll talk about the experiments that showed that. Fascinating stuff. from University of Chicago had a lot of the early sleep studies, and a couple of people went into a cave in Kentucky. They went deep into a cave. I'll show you the actual study later, and just eliminate any sunlight for 32 days, and measure their body temperatures, measure their sleep, and you still have a circadian cycle, but it gets reset by light. And that's what we'll talk about on Wednesday, is this how light interacts, how diurnal cycles and circadian rhythms interact. But the first thing that was really fascinating about these circadian rhythms, 1729, this guy, whose name I'm not going to, Jean-Jacques whatever, um, he did this study where he took a plant. Okay, so the Mimosa pudica, or however you pronounce that, and he completely enclosed it in darkness. It had no access to light. And what these plants normally do, right, they're going to follow that sunlight, heliotropism, right? They're going to follow the sunlight. They're going to face the sunlight. Now, we talked about that with like vascular endothelial growth factor. I made a reference to this. Where, oh, I'm hypoxic over here, send in some blood vessels. We sort of grow in the direction of hypoxia for our vasculature. Plants, remember, kind of grow and lean and distort themselves in the direction of sunlight. Now, before this guy, what was thought was it was just this automatic response that you see the direction of sunlight, and the photons are hitting me at this angle. Whatever, here's my lux, right? Light energy is, and the nature of it and the direction and where it is and whatever. So it's just an acute response. So what does this guy do? He encloses the plant in darkness and is able to measure it anyway, and sees that the plant, it still demonstrates heliotropism. It still does it in complete darkness. The plant has an internal biological clock that isn't acutely responding to sunlight. It actually can have its circadian rhythm without any input from the sun. It has no idea where the sun is. Now, what he thought was, how fascinating that this plant can still sense the sun when it has no access to those beams, right? It has no contact, no connection with the sun. It can still sense where it is, but that's not actually what's happening. It has an internal clock, just like everything else. So this is the actual plant right here. Here's me in Uganda touching it. This is the plant he's talking about. That's me terrorizing the plant in Uganda. So we have really pronounced circadian rhythms. We are diurnal creatures. We're awake during the day and asleep during night, despite disruptions. And as we get to those disruptions, man, pretty much everybody is battling disruption all the time. Even if, think about the term midnight. Midnight means sort of like an astronomical sense, it's the middle of the night, right? But what is midnight to us? Midnight is, I don't know, the fridge is open, looking at those lights, or the house lights, you're just turning them off, or you're sending your last email, or you're sort of dozing off, but there's something going on. There's lights around you all the time. That's not really the middle of the night to us anymore. And so not even counting like, oh, I'm doing graveyard shift, or we have disruptions of circadian rhythms of this diurnal cycle, this day-night, light-dark cycle that we're sort of incompatible with what the planet is doing. But we have circadian rhythms. It's about, again, it's about 24 hours. We'll get to this later. On average, it's about 24 hours and 15 minutes, but it gets reset. But everyone's a little bit different with this stuff. This internal circadian rhythmicity. We're trying to predict, just like a plant, we're trying to predict the external environment. Our body is doing it internally. But we're all different. There are morning larks, which means you wake up early. I tend to get up, I don't know, between 4:45 and 6. Depends on the day. That's on average, it's maybe like 5:20, give or take 20 minutes or so is about when I get out of bed. Some days is 4:45, some days is 5:30, something like that. If I sleep in until 6, that's like, man, that was a long sleep. But I go to bed really early, right? So I'm what people would call a lark, a morning lark, and that's just sort of biologically what I do. Other people are night owls, right? The expression that's a little bit more common than the lark. Now these differences tend to be, these chronotypes, these differences, they tend to be genetic, but not always, right? So this is from the same article as the last slide, where, okay, here's our wakefulness is in yellow, and we're sort of like normal-ish wakefulness, advanced sleep phase, delayed sleep phase. So this is the morning lark. This is the night owl over here, sort of conventional sleep period. Some short sleepers. Try not to be this person in life. That's not healthy. But you can be this or this. If you think about sort of the assembly of genomes, where we come from, where our biology was programmed. We had tribes, all right, and we had predators, and there were threats. You don't just go into your house and go into bed and set the temperature and have a nice like cup of tea and lock the doors and go to sleep listening to whatever. And I think it wasn't a safe world in these tribal societies, and our genes are essentially the same as they used to be back then. Potentially less hairy, I don't know. And so it's helpful if in our DNA some of the people in this tribe are night watchmen and watchwomen, right? If some of them are just like, I'm up kind of late, I'm keeping my eye out for safety. And if other people are alert during the day, if there's 24 hours a day that somebody is watching the camp, that somebody can alert the rest of the camp, the rest of the tribe, if an intruder is coming, that would be helpful. And just telling people, all right, you be the late night person now, and what if it's incompatible with biology, that's not really helpful for survival. And so it makes sense that across the species, across the human race, that we would have morning larks and night owls, that there are people who just biologically, they're chronotype. They thrive at night. They're most alert during the night. They function better. They think more clearly. They have just keener attention in those night hours as compared to the morning larks. Like me, I get to about 6 o'clock, and if you ask me, like, what'd you do today? I look at you blankly. I have no idea. What words? You just said words at me. It gets late in the evening, and I just can't function. First thing in the morning, I'm terrible at function too. My peak is probably like 8 o'clock to right before this class. It's probably like my peak. I sort of peter out right before this class. But it was sort of after this class, I just do a lot of blank staring. So there are times of the day where people are more alert, and those chronotypes, a lot of that is genetically determined. Now, a lot of it's also behavioral. If people establish habits where they don't expose themselves to sunlight until noon or something like that, they can reset their chronotype, just like jet lag. Like, go fly. If Ross just did it, right? Was that like 9 hours away, I think, 9 hours or so, something like that. It probably takes about 9 days to acclimate, about 9 days. The suprachiasmatic nucleus will get there. For that to reset your biological clock, it's probably over a week before the jet lag wears off, legitimately wears off. You may be able to dial yourself in a little bit before that point, but actual biological acclimation takes a little bit longer than the presentation of, oh, I'm okay. Uh, and so it's the same thing where if you induce a form of jet lag in your just daily behaviors, you're up until 2 in the morning exposing yourself to light, and then you sort of sleep in a dark room, you can reset your biological clock. But there are also chronotypes. There's also a genetic version of this, so that these sort of tribes can survive. And we'll talk about stuff like birds, what birds do, what those flocks do. Really fascinating stuff. How birds sleep to watch the flock, so that um, and they sleep differently if they're by themselves as compared to um, in a line. In a line, it gets really interesting. But night owls, a lot of once you hit puberty, there is a delay. You do experience that suprachiasmatic nucleus. You experience a delay, and post-pubescent students tend to have a more night owly, a delayed shift in those circadian rhythms. And yet we set the school schedule pretty early, and we just assume, let's use another cliche: the early bird catches the worms. And we talk about how, oh, you kids are lazy. You didn't get up on time. You're not getting out of bed early. You're just lazy. No, that's a biologically false sentence. And it really disrupts brain development. So these early school times, I mean, notice all my classes are like 2 o'clock and 12:30 and whatever. I don't want to like bludgeon people with these early hours any more than I want to bludgeon myself with them. Uh, but especially when you're looking at like high school, middle school, stuff like this, these early school times um, are potential like neurological deficits is what they would be introducing, as they compromise sleep, and especially compromise REM sleep. REM sleep tends to be what you get later in the night, early morning, late at night. That's the REM sleep is where you're getting that. Critical for brain development, and we're missing it if we start school time so early. So this was just average school start time 8:07 California schools but then this .gov site was looking at sort of when schools start. This is nationwide, to all public high schools. Before 7:30 is quite a few. 7:30, 7:59. So public policy, government policy, this favors morning risers, of which there are few of school-aged students. Now, as you get into college, maybe you're shifting back a little bit, settling into more normal times. Not everybody, some people, but certainly you're in high school, you're in middle school, and there's a biological clock. This isn't lazy people. This isn't a matter of bad habits. This isn't a matter of you just don't want to go to bed. This is none of those things. This is actual human biology, and it is. Just an incredible disservice to neural development of the American student. And so we should be making school much later. Um, Even in the workforce, though, you get into the workforce, and it's a lot of I don't know, like 7 o'clock is really when people are on the road getting to work. I mean, people like the 9 to 5 job. Like, who's going 9? I mean, everyone is like 7:30. You're there by 8, whatever. You're getting up before. The world operates on a lark's schedule, and there's a bias there that is really biologically harmful to an enormous percentage of um, of society, right? If you are biologically a night owl, it is difficult for you to get out of bed in the morning. Your body just doesn't do it effectively. You compromise sleep, and with compromised sleep, we see elevated risks of everything. Um, Everything from diabetes to heart disease to um, dementia. I mean, just you go down the list and everything is there. And we're just enforcing this on people as a matter of policy. So there's a few things as we talk about circadian rhythms and sleep and wakefulness. Sleep is, I don't know, a third of our life. Let's just say we sleep for 8 hours. A third of our life is sleep. 2/3 of our life are wakefulness, and hopefully at least half of that 2/3, maybe 8 of those hours, uh, is very wakeful and attentive, and you can actually perform. There's a few things that are going to determine this. The circadian rhythm, right, our internal cuckoo clock, just like heliotropism in those plants, is not just sunlight, right? We have a hormonal clock that gets set and ticks and ticks and ticks and turns and wakes us up and puts us to bed. There's a circadian rhythm that is independent of sunlight. And then there's sunlight, right? There's the diurnal piece. There's the day-night cycle, and the rising sun and the setting sun, and the uh, exposure to light and the withdrawal of light and exposure to darkness. That also is a critical variable in determining sleep and wakefulness, and how we approach both. And then there's non-photic wakefulness. So again, photon, non-light wakefulness, food, exercise, certain drugs, caffeine, Adderall, something like that. If you're exercising, if you're eating, where all this stuff. Now, this is much less important than these two. These are like mama and papa of your sleep and wakefulness. This is less important, this one down here, but it does still influence our sleep cycle, and we can set our circadian rhythm, not just with light, but with when are you exercising, when are you eating, what is your, pharmacological regimen, stuff like that. But these top two, really are the most important things. We're going to do part of, circadian rhythms today from the perspective of rising from slumber. On Wednesday, we'll talk about going to bed, what sets you into the mattress all exhausted. But what gives you this energy, this urge to leave bed, just try to stay in bed all day. Do it as an experiment. As an experiment, where you can pee and then go back to bed, because at that point the urge to urinate is going to be the driving factor that leaps you out of bed. But just try to stay in bed for a whole day and don't get out and just lay there with nothing to do. You're going to go crazy, right? You just need to get up and move and do something and be active. Now, why do you need to get up out of bed and do something and be active? Why are verbs a part of your day? What is this internal urge for this stuff? Well, there's a lot of hypothetical, food-seeking behaviors and stuff, but chemically, the mechanism for this, cortisol mainly, and then also epinephrine. Now, epinephrine in both the adrenal glands and the brain, cortisol from the adrenal cortex. These things, and cortisol is studied more for this, are the diurnal rhythms. When you see this day-night cycle for these two hormones, cortisol, steroid hormones, glucocorticoid, meaning adrenal cortex, cortisol from the cortex of the adrenal gland, and then epinephrine, also the adrenals, but the adrenal medulla or medulla. So lots of work on circadian rhythms of cortisol. This rise in the morning. If you're going to test your cortisol levels, go to the doctor's office, get a blood draw, test your cortisol. What you're going to see is this elevated morning levels, and then it's going to drop. So it's going to decline. So you're going to rise, decline. And so the morning cortisol is going to be elevated. And what is cortisol doing? Well, earlier this semester, we talked about stress hormone, right, in response to stress, right? So this is the Hans Selye general alarm reaction, where we are alarmed, there's a stressor, and we get that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal activation from the adrenal cortex, release cortisol, right? Steroid hormone mobilizes energy substrates. Let's get us ready to endure this thing. Now, steroid hormones last a little bit longer. Their effect does. They're slower acting, longer lasting. Epinephrine is part of that adrenal response, the sympathoadrenal medullary response, the adrenal medulla or medulla. And that is it's an amine hormone. It's a catecholamine, meaning amino acid, right? So it's in the polypeptide class of hormones, one amino acid. It's an amine hormone. And that is fast acting, shorter lasting, but you see a rise of that as well. You see the epinephrine here. So here's epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine, this is the neurotransmitter version. So this is released from nerves. You do get a little bit of norepi released from the adrenal medulla. There's a little bit is going to be released from there, but mostly what's released from the adrenal gland is epinephrine. Epinephrine is released from the adrenal gland, and that's our endocrine version of this. And epinephrine, I mean, look at the levels. So you sleep and it's low, and it's especially low. You get into r.e.m sleep. We'll talk about that later. But at wake, right, we're seeing high epinephrine at wake. There's a trend of norepinephrine. There's a trend that's not significant, right, from the statistically significant perspective. But there's a visual pattern there. Epinephrine, there's a significant difference in what happens, and this was just they're looking at a bunch of people, they're sampling every like 7 minutes or something, every looking at levels of this stuff, ages 18 to 35. So throughout the lifespan, this stuff is going to be a little bit different. Exercise influences this. There's a lot of history of training and stress, and all of these things can affect this, but this is in a population. This is what you expect to see. So there's norepinephrine. So this is sleep onset right here, and this is you're waking up right here. So epinephrine, sleep onset, it's going down, 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 down. Awakening, up, 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 up. So epinephrine and cortisol, this urge when you were just lying in bed and you're awake and like, okay, it's time to go confront the day. That urge to get out of bed in the morning, that's really what's driving us from the mattress. That pressure, that desire to get out of bed and go accomplish and go be productive and whatever. Now, what you see is, especially with cortisol in the literature, there's a connection with melatonin. Now, you've seen melatonin in, I don't know, you go to, like, you can buy it on Amazon, you can get it from Safeway, you can get melatonin, which is a little bit weird because it's a hormone. And hormones are usually prescription drugs. Think like, cortisone. Can you just go get your cortisone at Safeway and do your own or prednisone or whatever? Do prednisone tabs or a little cortisone injection or something? No. Can you get estrogen from Safeway? No. Can you get growth hormone from Safeway? No. Can you get testosterone? Can you get insulin, like growth factor or insulin? All of these hormones, you got to go to the doctor and get this prescription. Melatonin is a hormone and a really important one, but you can just go get it from Safeway. It's a little bit weird. But there's an intricate connection between the hormones of arousal and the hormone of slumber. Melatonin, let's get us ready for bed. When you get this surge in epinephrine and this surge in cortisol, you seem to set the timer, you set the clock. Maybe it's 12 hours, maybe it's 14 hours, but you set this internal timer to say, all right, let's start moving in the direction of the pineal gland or the pineal gland. It depends where you're from. If you're from like Texas or the South or Florida or whatever, it's pineal. If you're a northerner, it's pineal. But the pineal gland, this is what's going to release your melatonin. And earlier I referred to it as like the vampire, hormone, because it's just light suppresses it. It comes out and it only comes out at night. Good Smashing Pumpkins song. But this is, you sort of set the timer for it when you get this release. Glucocorticoids, cortisol. And this rhythm, this 24-hour rhythm that we see in cortisol is connected to the clock-related genes. Suprachiasmatic nucleus is what we'll be talking about. The optic chiasm, your optic nerves where they cross that chiasmus, the chiasm, the crossing, the pineal gland, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus, rather, sits right above that. Suprachiasmatic. But these things are connected. There's this bouncing back and forth between morning and night, between the melatonin and the epinephrine and especially cortisol of setting the timer. So you get this glucocorticoid release and you're potentiating that nocturnal melatonin synthesis. But it takes time. You just set the timer and say, okay, here's when I'm getting out of bed. I'm going to set the timer for when I should go to sleep. And that has nothing to do with sunlight. You can establish, you can fine tune the clock with sunlight, but your internal clock is already doing it for you. The intrinsic expression of clock genes, right, are coming from this, but there's also, it's going the other way around. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, that's what the SCN is, adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? So if you're going to do the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the hypothalamus is going to release that corticotropin releasing hormone, and then the pituitary releases adrenocorticotropic hormone. So there's an exchange between those things that is part of your circadian rhythm. The other part of your circadian rhythm is going to be light stimulus, which continues to correct your internal clock. Your internal clock is going to be a little bit longer than a day. We'll talk about that on Wednesday. And you need constant correction of it. It just gets, it's like an old bad watch that just, it runs fast. And every once in a while you have to, or actually in this case, it like runs slow. And, every couple of days you have to reset the thing so it stays on time. You just have to keep tuning it. And that's what light stimulus is doing. It keeps tuning our internal clock. And this is a little bit different. It's a little bit weaker, but we'll get there as well. So that's it for today, unless we have questions. Nick asked, what is about sleep so important? Why can't we just close our eyes for 8 hours and reap all the benefits? There are benefits that we'll talk about to non-sleep deep rest, meditation, where you shut down, but you don't actually totally fall asleep. And there's, apps, and there are little YouTube videos and stuff where you can do this, where you sort of like focus on your body parts. All right, now you think about your pinky finger and your middle finger and whatever. You sort of go through the body. There are real experiments that show how that is valuable, and learning after that, you can enhance if you do that in the middle of the day. Let's say you get up like 8 a.m. you have 4 or 5 hours of mental activity, go do that, meditate or do that. And then the subsequent block of awake time, or a nap is going to work too. That subsequent block of awake time, you have a better capacity to learn. But being awake at all, it's sort of low-grade brain damage, and you fix it by sleeping. And we'll talk about the different sleep cycles, what's happening to your brain in those, sort of the different brain waves, and consolidating memories. So like consolidation, if you learn something, you're going to store it in the hippocampus for a period. The hippocampus, that's not a place for long-term memory. The hippocampus is a holding cell, and you can hang on to information temporarily there. If you have, it's a hard drive that has like 100 megs or something, but every day you're getting in, 100 new megs of information, and so you have to consolidate. You have to send that information somewhere else into permanent storage, and sleep does that. You're not going to do that without sleep. So the consolidation of information, long-term memory storage, and the brain damage that develops and sleep deprivation. Man, sleep is, there's no drug that can compete with sleep in terms of management of health or optimization of performance or focus, anything like that. So for athletes, get at least 8. At least 8 hours, and I'll bring on probably Wednesday. I'll bring up a couple of studies about when we're doing temperature and that circadian temperature. I'll talk about, Nathaniel and I did an abstract on that, and the association with sleep and optimal performance. We did a different abstract. I think Marie and maybe Will Leiden might have been on it. I don't remember. About optimal performance in times of day using Proteus, and there's a different phenomenon there of these circadian rhythms. When are you optimized for sleep? When are you optimized for performance? It's all circadian rhythms.
You spoke about sharks earlier, and then not sleeping. But I've heard from with the gills, like they need the counter current, they need the water flow constantly against
That
the
they can
gill.
never stop moving.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I've heard that too. I've never validated it. It's probably true that that they can't stop swimming. But so there's a phenomenon in a lot of aquatic life, and this is the fascinating part about birds can do it. We can do it a little bit, but it's bad. We don't want to do it. You sleep with half your brain. Half your brain, one hemisphere stays awake and the other hemisphere goes to sleep. What a dolphin does. Now a dolphin gets, aquatic mammals, right? And again, I'll come back to this as I'm talking about these different sleep stages and what happens and why certain creatures sleep in certain ways and which creatures are eligible to have REM and all that. But aquatic mammals need to surface. They're going to drown if they don't surface. And if they go into REM sleep, they have to paralyze their whole body. They would die. And so as you see something like seals that are, when they're on land, they have REM sleep. When they're in the water, barely any, maybe 5%, 10% tops of the amount of REM sleep. And so certain fish can be sleeping and use half their brain. They're shut down half their brain, use the other half, and then toggle. Like, all right, now I'm going to use the other one. And then they can use their full brain at times too. But like REM sleep requires the whole brain to be asleep. So I'm not sure in sharks. It may be a half brain thing, but I'm unsure of shark sleep. But that's how a lot of animals will do it. Is they'll take one hemisphere offline and just operate on the other. Other questions? The last thing I want to do for these lectures. Not like not like at the end of the semester what I want to do, but the thing that I don't want to do. That's what I mean by the last thing I want to do is give people sleep anxiety. I used to be like this, where I would look at my clock. This is also a lot of the reason that I just set my classes late. Is I want to be able to sleep in a little bit. If I have trouble sleeping at night, I want to be able to sleep in a little bit in the morning. And because if I have something early in the morning, what I used to do all the time, I haven't done this in years because it's what a horrible way to live, is I would look at the clock and say, all right, if I fell asleep right now, I would get 6 hours of sleep. And then, all right, if I fell asleep right now, I get 5 hours and 42 minutes of sleep. All right, if I fell asleep right now, I get 4 hours and 49 minutes of sleep. I would look at the clock and knowing what time I have to wake up, and I would just count it down all night. If I fell asleep right now, I'd still get an hour of sleep. And you just get sleep anxiety. And you're like, oh no, the consequences of me not sleeping. What a horrible place to be. Of having that type of anxiety piled on top of all the other stressors we already have. That doesn't help you fall asleep at night. So the last thing I want to do is induce sleep anxiety, but I do want to illustrate the importance of it because sleep deprivation probably is the biggest stressor that threatens humanity. And we're all doing it, and most animals don't. If you have a pet, look over what that pet is doing right now. It's probably asleep. If it's a cat, it's a dog, it's probably up like snoring in the corner or something. People are unique in our deliberate sleep deprivation. Oh, I can't go to sleep right now. I have to do XYZ, or I don't want to go to sleep. Every other animal, with exception of things like, they're in migration at the time or something, if it's like a bird in migration, okay, we have some exceptions to this. But pretty much every other animal just sleeps. Oh, I have sleep pressure. I'm going to go ahead and, call it for the night. Unless it's a nocturnal animal, I'm going to call it for the day. We don't do that. And the important part of these lectures is that we should like stop studying, right? Stop um whatever your stresses are, and I just put them away. It's not as important as sleep. Oh, I have an assignment due. Who gives a shit? Like, just sleep. Sleep is better than your assignment. You'll get farther in life if you sleep more.
Honestly never understood the concept of all-nighters. Like I felt like if I didn't know, and like I knew what I knew by like 12 or 1, and after that I'm out. Like I can't focus after a certain time.
The all-nighter is fascinating, and as we talk on Wednesday about the rest of the circadian rhythms, and we transfer into light, and what happens with light. Now, Nathaniel, I may be asking for some input as when he does his night shifts. But there's the worst possible time during a night shift seems to be like, it depends on if you're a morning lark or a night owl or whatever, but 5 a.m., 6 a.m., something like that. And once that sun rises, it's like you can get a second wind for a little while. So there's a couple of different things. And again, I'm going to talk about it in detail soon, but adenosine. This is what caffeine inhibits. When you drink caffeine, you're inhibiting adenosine binding. Nathaniel, 3:30 a.m. sucks. And so, yeah, it depends on your circadian rhythm of what is normally your wake time. But when you hit your circadian rhythm, you get a second wind for a little while. But adenosine continues to build up and build up and build up and build up, which gives you this sleep pressure, this sort of hunger, this ravenous appetite for sleep as it builds up, builds up, builds up. But that's different from the light and this sort of normal circadian rhythm. We're like, oh, okay, well, I guess now's the time we release our epinephrine and our cortisol, and we get moving, but you still have all that adenosine. And so you get this weird, drowsy second wind where there's an amount of alertness, but maybe it's a little bit fuzzy. And so the all-nighter, it doesn't really work for cognitive functions. It does work for just like, let me go get food. Let me do food seeking behaviors. Let me do some sort of laborious thing. Let me just get through a task that doesn't require mental calculation. So for a final, pulling an all-nighter or whatever, that's not helpful. that's just harmful. You're never going to remember that information. Other questions, comments?
I have a question
Yeah.
and a comment. Have you ever heard of like the 90-minute sleep cycle?
Mhm.
I feel
Circadian
like
sleep
that
cycles.
really works though. Like I've tried it out and I feel like if I were to sleep late, sleeping for either 4.5 hours or 6 hours would be better than waking up in 5 hours. Or am I just conditioning myself to believe that?
Maybe a little of both. Yeah, no, we do have these ultradian sleep cycles where you kind of go through these sequences of sleep. As people get older, sleep is more fragmented, and it can become a little bit harder to cycle nicely. Um, but if you have like a Fitbit or a Whoop or whatever, one of these things that'll wake you up when you're in light sleep, you don't want to be woken up when you're in deep sleep, non-REM deep sleep. That to wake up during that, you're just gonna be drowsy for a long time. You like, why get up at all? Just go back to bed. Um, but yeah, you want to be woken up during the right time in the right sleep cycle. Um, so we'll talk about those different things, what kind of light sleep, the different stages of non-REM sleep and REM sleep, and what's going on in your brain, and yeah, we'll do all that stuff on
And then
Wednesday.
we're not doing the group project anymore, right? Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I don't think anybody wants to do
Okay.
presentations, right?
So it's just the 2 tests and that's it for a
Just the
grade.
2 tests. No, I'd be happy to accommodate if people want to do something else. I got the impression we would rather just like have lectures and then do a couple of tests and have that be it, as opposed to everyone also do projects. Those test dates exactly. 2 tests is fine with me. Yeah, because that was last time we chatted. That was the impression I got. I was like, nobody actually wanted to go, and that's totally fine. I'm happy to just do some lectures on sleep. I think it's the most important thing to end on, because we are going to bring back some earlier topics a little bit as we go into sleep. But I'll start the final exam. I'll probably do 4 lectures on sleep, and then I'll start the final shortly after, and I'll just give you, a week or two, whatever, to do it. Does that sound agreeable to everyone? And there'll be like 4 possible takes on it. And let me know if like your internet crashes and it consumes a take.
You know how you were telling us whether you tell us like instead of telling us like, oh, this is the right answer, can you just tell us what question we got wrong? Because like, or do we have to figure out what question we got
Yeah.
wrong?
Okay.
Like I'm not asking for the answer. I'm just
No, I
asking.
get what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I totally get what you're saying. Let me make sure that Canvas will do that. Because what I don't want to do is for Canvas, because I get exactly what you're saying, and I totally agree with you, and I want to do that so that you know what to go look up and what to learn. Because the idea is learning. I just want people to learn stuff and to not be sleep deprived while they do it, or super stressed out adding to your allostatic load. And so you go through a test, and the test is a little bit hard, and you like maybe bomb it a little bit the first time. You're like, okay, here's all the stuff I got wrong, and then go just learn all those things. Like, okay, let me go look up these things, and you end up acing it in the end. And in the end, you learn everything I wanted you to learn in the beginning, but you also get a good grade and it's lower stress. Let me make sure, because what I don't want is for Canvas to say, here's what you got wrong and the answer that was right, because like then that's not learning. That's just let me take it again and click on the right thing. So either way, I will do that. But if Canvas doesn't do it, I'll go through and just tell everybody. I'll just go individually and say, all right, you missed numbers, X, Y, Z. So yeah, that will happen whether Canvas does it or I do it.
And did you say when the tests, like the 2 tests are going to be, like which date?
Yeah, so the last test, so the first test, wherever we're done. So there isn't like another test and a final. We're just gonna do one test, and then that'll be the other thing for the semester. And it takes me a little bit of time to make it. And so maybe if I do 4 sleep lectures, right after that last sleep lecture, I'm just going to be making the test, and give me 2 or 3 days to get it fully assembled and loaded. And then you'll have, like 2 weeks or something like that to get through it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question about next semester. Um, if we are in person, would class only be in person, or would there be like an option to do it online?
There'll be
Or
options. Yeah. It's almost guaranteed going to be in person, owing to the number of COVID vaccinations that are like, it's like 1 million a day or whatever it is. And but for my classes, at least, I'm gonna have like, I'll just upload lectures and people can just do it online, and if they want to, if there's scheduling conflicts or if there's health reasons or whatever, I really don't care what the reason is. Not that I don't care personally what the reason is, but I don't care professionally. It's not like you need to have a doctor's stamp or whatever. I don't know. Whatever your reason is good enough for me. If you want to do it online, that's fine.
thank you.
Earlier you talked about the kind of genetic roots in that tribal setting we've evolved to adapt to. Are you going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few lectures, like the biphasic sleep or polyphasic sleep?
Yeah, I mean, historically, there's some fascinating stuff where what people used to do was, I mean, I'll talk about naps, and so, you know, night sleep, nap, night sleep, and incredibly effective. I mean, everyone should nap. I don't, but I think everyone should. But there used to be, the way people would sleep was in 2 4-hour blocks, and they'd get up and like they do a 4-hour block and they'd get up and just like have a good time. You know, they go be social, they'd eat, they'd go to a party, whatever. Then they go back to bed in 4 hours. Like, that's not the human genome. It was not equipped to do that. That was a cultural sort of deliberate enforcing of a sleep schedule when we used to do that. But I'll talk about the different. Yeah, I'll get a little bit more into that stuff, and then if I don't get as deep into it, feel free to ask questions, and if I know the answers, I'll give them.
So sounds good.
All right, I'll see everyone.